Welcome to session 4 of the lecture series on Middle High German. On late Middle High German, we are joined today by William Thurwell, who has helped edit the English version of the lecture.
Lecture 4, Late Middle High German. Functional differentiation. Shortly after 1300, it is possible to discern new tendencies in the vernacular linguistic sources, which, initially, were not overly extensively attested. To be able to classify these better, I'll first offer a few notes on the sociolinguistic context. In the second half of the 13th century, there was a massive increase in German language literature, both quantitatively, the number of German charters increased 20-fold from the third to the fourth quarter of the century, but also qualitatively, insofar as the vernacular increasingly penetrated domains of knowledge where the written transmission had hitherto been reserved for Latin. The domains of law and administration were particularly affected by this development. It is therefore understandable that at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries, it became increasingly necessary to renegotiate the functional distribution of Latin and the vernacular. In such contexts, it is legitimate to point out the deficits of Latin for the first time. The already mentioned Ottokar aus der Hall reports in his Styrian rhymed chronicle, circa 1300-1318, that Rudolf von Habsburg, who is testified as being a promoter of German charters, opposed a Latin plea of Bishop Bernhard von Seckau on the basis that an imperial matter should be discussed in German. Latin, Ottokar continues, is now functionally so limited that it belongs in the presbyteries in Mainz or Trier, namely the spiritual sphere.
Der Vielwohlgeborn von Rom, der König Rudolf, sprach zu dem Bischof: Habt ihr echt zu schaffen mit de keinem Pfaffen, da Latine zugehore, das Bart ruft die Chore zu Mainze oder zu Trier. Habt aber ihr gegen mir oder gegen den Grieche ich zu suchen, des mag ich us den Burchen mit Worte nicht gefolgen. Wir werden darum erbeugen, die Herren alle, die ihr hier seht.
The formulation aus den Burchen is striking here. On the one hand, it makes it clear that writing around 1300 was still strongly associated with Latin language. In addition, however, it reflects certain specifics around communication, the problems of which may also be based on the oral presentation of a text conceived in writing. Barely a generation later, the awareness of the functional limitations of Latin in certain domains of use changed to an unspecific value judgment. In the Liber Curtarum Historiarum, written around 1340, Johannes von Viktring tells us about a decision made by Rudolf von Habsburg regarding the issuance of royal charters.
Decretum in his curiis fuit ut privilegia vulgarita conscribantur, quia latinitatis difficultas errores et dubia maxima pariebat et laicos decipebat. Statuit etiam, quod propter communem intelligentiam obscure latinitatis privilegia et litere et cetera vulgarita conscribantur, quod patet ex eo, quod ante sua tempora nulle litere vulgaritas scripte reperiuntur de negotiis vel contractibus dibus rumque.
Here, Latin has become a dark, error-prone, and by tendency, criminal idiom. To avoid a misunderstanding, for the 14th century, such statements, no matter how general they seem to be formulated by Johann von Viktring, were de facto limited to the domain of imperial administration, quite apart from the fact that these are declarations of intent that in no way lead to the Latin to be eliminated as a limited language in all regions and at all hierarchical levels. In other domains, especially in the vicinity of the church, no one would have thought of putting forward such or similar views at that time. We'll now move on to administrative and legal language. The emergence of vernacular administrative writing, prose, goes hand in hand with the aforementioned increase in the importance of cities, which has consequences not only socio-economically, but also linguistically and culturally. A new type of secular intellectual, someone who is at the same time a lawyer, a clerk, and a writer, begins to emerge in the municipal offices. Master Hesse, who is attested as head of the city chancellery in Strasbourg from 1230 to 1240, is the first city clerk known by name in the history of German language and literature. Furthermore, in the middle of the 13th century, Gottfried Hagen worked as a Cologne city clerk, and in this capacity wrote, amongst other things, a comprehensive Cologne city chronicle. However, This does not formally belong to the contemporary literary avant-garde, because it was written in traditional rhyming couplet form. German is gradually making its way into the language of charters, law, and business. However, the relevant tradition is of a variety and breadth that can hardly be surveyed, so we must be wary of making generalizations. As such, the following overview neither aims for completeness, nor does it claim to provide a chronology of the emergence of German administrative charters. A complete transmission of the Middle High German charter language only began in the second third of the 13th century, and thus on the threshold of late Middle High German. Nevertheless, there is at least one precursor worth mentioning, the so-called Cologne shrine cards. Shrine cards are large format sheets of parchment that mainly contain records of real estate transactions and property, and can be somewhat described as the forerunners of today's land registers. Like all charters created in the German Empire up to the High Middle Ages, the language of the Cologne shrine cards is Latin. There is, however, one notable exception, namely Shrine Card 3 of the Lauchens parish, where passages of Middle High German, more precisely Riparian, entries are recorded in the context of certification that can be dated to between 1159 and 1172. The introductory formula aside, Middle High German dominates in the following entry.
Haec carta vobis omnibus notificat qualiter Adelheid, uxor Lucemanni, dat hus hevet gemachet, das Haltscheide, da sie innewohnet, is ihren zwein Sonnen, Erimano et Edmundo, oft sieht in Sparen macht, dat ne gein ihre Anderkinde nevet daranne, ne have ne wäre die zwene Sonne, die sie da gemachet habet.
Whether the somewhat awkward style of the German passage refers to the lack of a written variety in the vernacular, or to its oral design, requires further investigation. Beyond this individual case, however, the same applies to the language of charters as it does too to legal or factual prose. There is a coexistence of material originally composed in Latin and spoken in the vernacular. Their respective linguistic structures interact in a variety of ways with the onset of writing in the vernacular. On the other hand, the oral beginnings of German charter language might also explain the conspicuously nimble and solid form with which, apart from certain forerunners like the shrine cards, practically appear from nowhere. This is particularly obvious in the era of charters in the narrower sense. Medieval charters, i.e. written testimonies of legal acts, follow a relatively rigid classification scheme, which serves as a memory aid for oral communication. At a macro level, they consist of a protocol, context, and a scatocol. The protocol ideally includes the invocatio, in the name of, the intitulatio, the name and title of the issuer, the inscriptio, naming of the recipient, and the arenga, a general rhetoric justification. The context ideally consists of a promulgatio, the declaration of intent to want to make law, the narratio, the list of the individual circumstances that prompted it, the dispositio, the lawmaking part, the sanctio, a threat of punishment in the event of an infringement, and the corroboratio, statement of the means of authentication. The escatocol includes the subscriptiones, i.e. signatures of exhibitors and witnesses, as well as the date. In specific charters, as a rule, individual points are left out, but essential elements of the charter form are always present, as can be indicated, for example, in a charter issued by King Rudolf von Habsburg. In the protocol, the invocatio and arenga are missing. The intitulatio names the issuer,
Wir, Rudolf von Gottes Gnaden,
and the inscriptio refers to the recipient in a formulaic manner.
Allen, die diesen Brief ansehend und hörend.
In the context, the promulgatio is absent, while the narratio, dispositio, and sanctio are present.
Und es wär den Fried unter ihn nicht zwären welle, der sie us dem Frieden.
The escatocol, which is omitted from the slide for space purposes, includes the date, as well as the signatures of witnesses and exhibitors, which in this case are hardly authentic. Further evidence for the assumption that German charter language went through an oral history before it found its way onto the parchment is a relatively large degree of independence from the Latin linguistic structures from the onset of their existence. This can be well demonstrated by a series of parallel Latin and German charters, the first of which is also one of the most well-known medieval charters of all. This is the Mainzer Landfrieden, passed by Friedrich II in 1235, which is considered the first German language imperial law. Its immediate comprehensibility, even among the lower nobility, ensures that the law is observed on a broad basis. This charter had a great influence on the subsequent Landfrieden legislation, which was carried out in German, particularly in the south and west of the empire. The Latin charter begins with the noun testes, witnesses, which is determined by a generalizing relative clause. Before the predicate of the main clause,
Teneantur veritati testimonium perhibero,
two ablative absolutes are inserted, on the first of which a relative clause depends. We will limit our comparison to two details of the German text. Right at the beginning, there is a free reformulation that is not caused by systematic linguistic constraints. Instead of formulating all witnesses whom the father names, like the Latin text does, the German text moves the Latin testes into the relative clause, all whom the father names as witnesses. The situation is somewhat different in the case of the ablative absolute, which has no equivalent in German. However, instead of imitating the Latin idiom with a construction of dative and participle, as would often be the case in Old or Early Middle High German, the German version of the Charter reproduces this through prepositional constructions.
Non obstante consanguinitate becomes nicht durch Magenschaft.
The qualitative profiling of German Charter language goes hand in hand with the quantitative profiling of the textual tradition. The focus of which, however, is to be found in the second half, and more precisely in the last fifth of the 13th century. The regional focus of the tradition is in Upper Germany, and partly also in West Central Germany. Finally, it must be pointed out that in the 13th century, Latin remained the dominant charter language in the German Empire. There are roughly 4,500 vernacular textual witnesses, compared to approximately 500,000 Latin ones. Only after 1350 did the proportion and importance of Latin charters decrease significantly in favour of the vernacular tradition. In contrast to the language of poets, we generally have better opportunities to date and localise the text of charters, even if the information in the Eschaticon must be compared with paleographic data. Nevertheless, charters have a much higher informative value when it comes to classifying linguistic developments, spatially and temporally. As an example, we'll return to the aforementioned Charter of Rudolf from Habsburg. In addition to the version that we had seen, and which comes from Rudolf's chancellery in Regensburg, Bavaria, a second copy of the Charter has survived, which was drawn up half a year later in Rudolf's chancellery in Mainz, Rhine-Franconia. First of all, we would like to briefly explain two important developments in the field of vocalism, which can be helpful for the linguistic and geographical classification of the two copies of the Charters. I'll systematically go into the Phonology Middle High German in the next session. The so-called New High German diphthongization of the Middle High German monophthongs I, U, U to I, Oi, and Au first appeared in Styria, southern Bavaria, as early as the 12th century, from which it first spread to central Bavaria in the 13th century. The monophthongization of the Middle High German diphthongs Ia, Ua, and Ua into New High German I, U, I, Ua, on the other hand, remained limited to Middle German textual witnesses until the 14th century. The map only showed the development of Middle High German Ua. Let's first look at the state of the language in the Bavarian Charter. From what we see in the written language, the diphthongization of Middle High German I, U, U had already taken place across the board. We have
Freiheit
instead of
Freiheit, Leut
instead of
Lüte
and
Gottshaus
instead of
Gottes Hus.
This finding is not surprising insofar as the new diphthongs spread in the 13th century from their South Bavarian origin in a northwesterly direction to the Danube, and then, in turn, to Regensburg. Also, within the scope of what can be expected in terms of linguistic geography, is the written finding of the Middle High German diphthong ur, which is consistently represented diacritically, namely by a V with a superscript O. There are numerous instances of syncope and apocope, the accumulation of which can also be considered characteristic of Bavarian written dialects of the 13th century. The consonants show a typically Bavarian feature, namely the word and syllable initial P spelling of the labial stop, here in
Priev
or
Regensburg.
Finally, a morphological characteristic of Bavarian written dialect is the retention of the old ending ent in the third person plural present indicative. In many cases, the Rhenish-Franconian version of the Charter behaves similarly to the Regensburg version. The New High German diphthongization has not yet taken place, as evidenced by spellings such as
Riches
or
Hus.
but the Central German monophthongization has. Compare the monographic vowel spellings in
Griff, Krieg, tun,
and
Ruder.
With regards to unstressed syllables, the Bavarian syncopes and apocopes are missing. Instead, there are a number of specifically Central German orthographic reflexes of the median Fettschreibung. Word initially, there is no shift of the voiced dental in
Tun,
instead of,
Turn.
while in
Krische,
the voiced velar plosive appears to be orthographically represented with a fricative sign in medial syllables. The morphological archaisms characteristic of the Bavarian textual witnesses are not found in the Mainz version, like the shortened form of the possessive pronoun
unsere,
instead of,
unserem.
typical of Rhenish Franconia. As much as the language of the Charter differs in most areas from the language of the literary tradition of the classical Middle High German period, one sociolinguistic similarity is unmistakable. In both cases, this is a written form of the upper classes of society. Therefore, when speaking of certain reflexes of orality in conjunction with the language of Charter, one should always remember that this does not mean the everyday language of the majority population, but the language use of the elite. Since the end of the 13th century, however, a type of source has been transmitted that, in a certain respect, demonstrates some aspects of the language of the majority of the peasant population, even if not always reliably. These sources are called herbaria. These are lists of goods and taxes of the manors. Their language is characterized by regional or even local features. They were used to identify properties and were often recorded on the basis of oral information from local farmers. For the recording of this oral information from farmers about local property conditions, portable scrolls, so-called Rödel after Latin rotulus, were primarily employed, using which fair copies, the actual herbaria, were created. Here you can see a Rödel in its characteristic form that belongs to the transmission network of the so-called Habsburg herbarium, and is now kept in the main state archives in Stuttgart. A fair copy of the herbarium was then made in conventional parchment codices, such as in the case of the Meinhardisches Gesamturbar from 1288, whose language we'll take a closer look at. The spelling of the number
Fünf
reflects the assimilation of N to M before the labial fricative, and is thus just as close to showing oral usage as the orthography in
Hühner,
which shows syncopation after a long root. The variance in the spelling of the number
vier,
is also striking. The development of the distribution between Latin and vernacular in the course of the history of the transmission of herbaria is in one sense comparable to the conditions that we see with charters. Before 1300, Latin textual witnesses, in black, dominate, while the German tradition, in red, is initially anecdotal. As early as the first half of the 14th century, vernacular herbaria gained the upper hand, which can be seen from the fact that, from this time onwards, they regularly appear in places that have no Latin herbarian tradition. We'll now move on to non-fiction, verse versus prose. Structurally, the situation in the area of non-fiction is largely comparable to what we've already heard about the legal prose. Vernacular non-fiction prose has been documented in isolated cases since Old High German. Take the Basel recipes, for example. Such early approaches did not gain traction in the tradition due to the highly Latin-oriented context in which they were created, and the prevalence of orality in the vernacular tradition up to the High Middle Ages. It is noteworthy, however, that a theoretical justification for the prose form of non-fiction literature was provided as early as the 12th century. This happens in the prologue, which was traditionally written in rhyming couplets, of the so-called Lucidarius, an originally Latin encyclopedia, the vernacular versions of which were transmitted until the early modern period. As in the case of the early Middle High German Rolandslied, Henry the Lion is the patron of the German version, and he is, to a certain extent, the protagonist of the following passage.
Sine Kapellane erhies, die Rede suchen an den Schriften, und bat, dass sie es dichten, ahne riemen wollten, wann sie en solden nicht schrieben, wann die Wahrheit, als es zu Latine steht.
In the 14th century, a Middle Low German encyclopedia was created based on an originally French, but also clearly Middle Dutch template with the title of Buch Siedrach. The similarity of this to Lucidarius cannot be denied when looking at the prologue, even if the affinity of the prose form to truth is only paraphrased.
Dit Book was in Walsche beschreven, sonder Rime in slechte Wort, start again. Dit boek was een walsje beschreven, zonder riem en slechte woord. Toen werd ik daar toe bekoord, dat ik dit boek woude maken, uit een walschen diertje spraken, zonder riem also ik zag, dat hier in dem walsche lag, omdat ik van die edele lere een woord niet woude anders keren.
Even between 1250 and 1350, large areas of non-fiction prose remained in Latin, but German material began to appear. Scientific texts, think of Conrad von Megenberg's Deutsche Spira, pharmacopoeias, travel literature, and encyclopedias, namely Conrad von Megenberg's Buch von natürlichen Dingen, which is usually misleadingly titled The Book of Nature. The spectrum of tradition in the area of sacred prose is particularly broad. In the course of the development of new religious practices, especially the emergence of mendicant orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, a significant corpus of German sermon literature emerged in the second half of the 13th century. Its most prominent author was the Franciscan Berthold von Regensburg, who was immensely popular during his lifetime, and has already been mentioned here in connection with the linguistic geographical structure of Middle High German. However, his sermons in the vernacular should be treated with caution in terms of historical linguistics, as they are German translations of Latin model sermons, and not transcripts of Middle High German sermon practice. If we single out the so-called Monk of Heilsbronn from the vast area of devotional and treatise literature, this again touches on the fact that, in the prologue, reflections are made about the suitability of the prose form to rhyming couplet verse. Two things are interesting in comparison with the Lucidarius prologue. Firstly, the fact that the prologue itself appears again in rhyming couplets, and secondly, that the prose form is once again brought into connection with truth, but this time is identified with the truth of salvation. Incidentally, there is little agreement on the salvation assuring function of the rhyming paired verse.
Auch han ich Mut in meinen Sinn, dass sich dis klein Buchlin welle ohne Reimen machen durch zweierhande Sachen, die erst, dass sich diese Heiligkeit mit nächtiger Wahrheit muge dester Pass bewahren, davon han ich Mut zu fahren, der gemeinen Red die Straßen und alles reimen lassen.
This functional justification of the prose form is obviously typical of treatise literature, as can also be seen from a type of instruction manual that precedes a confessional treatise written in the third quarter of the 14th century, i.e. shortly after the end of the late Middle High German period. The argumentation we saw in the example before is pointed out here in ascetic tradition.
Willst du aber getrüwäcklichen biechten und woll, so merke diese kleine Lehre, die hiernach geschrieben steht. Sie ist mit gebuberischten Worten geschrieben, ahne Riemen und Gezierde, davon ist sie zu lesen verdrossentlichen und schwere und bringet sie doch der Seele Nutze.
The prose form, according to the anonymous text, does not provide any reading pleasure, and is therefore particularly good for conveying the notion of salvation. In addition, of course, it is notable that the prologue of the Bichtebuch is actually written in prose, in contrast to the sources just discussed. However, before using this as a further profiling of the prose form, it should be considered that texts dealing with confession and penance, like their Latin models, have tended, almost without exception, to be written in prose since the Old High German period. For the purposes of time, we will not deal with the intellectually important contribution of German scholasticism and mysticism to late Middle High German today. But, instead, we will look at how scholasticism and mysticism relate to word formation, where they have had an important role to play. So moving to Bible Epic, the Austrian Bible translator. In the history of the language of German, Martin Luther's September Testament of 1522 is still regarded as a turning point, which, for the first time, made the text of the Holy Scriptures accessible to a lay audience, without Latin proficiency. In this context, important references are made to older Bible translations, starting with the bilingual version of Tatian's Gospel Harmony in Codex Sangalensis 56, created in Fulda around 830, with the caveat that these sources are still within the domain of the Latin written culture of the early and high Middle Ages. However, this presentation may require partial revision, and I will explain the reasons why shortly. About 2 centuries before Luther, in the first half of the 14th century, an anonymous author prepared an annotated prose translation of large parts of the Bible for a lay audience. The translation was widely received, 136 textual witnesses are currently known, 72 of them are commentaries on the Psalms, and 27 belong to the so-called Klosterneuburg Gospels. In view of such numbers, the relevance of this source for historical linguistic purposes should be quite clear. It is all the more astonishing that the scientific study of the Austrian Bible translator's oeuvre has only begun in recent years. A project is currently underway at the Bavarian Academy of Sciences to develop an edition, the results of which could provide the basis for a reassessment of the history of German Bible translation. We should not go into detail here about the many reasons why these sources have been neglected for many years. Let us instead take a look at the text, specifically at the prologue of the Gutweig manuscript of the Gospel work. After the anonymous narrator has asked God for help in communicating his commandments and Christian doctrine, he legitimizes his translation work as follows.
An diesen Dingen geruch mich, Herr Jesu Christe, bestätigen und befesten und teil mit mir die Gnade deines Heiligen Geistes, dass ich die Arbeit, der ich, Herr, hier beginne, mit deiner Hilfe also vollbring, dass du, Herr, allmächtiger Gott, gelobt und geehrt werdest, min sündige Seel Gnad empfahre, und dass dir ungelehrten Laien mit der Hoffnung deiner gottgleichen Lehr, als uns die heiligen Evangelisten von dir geschrieben haben, an Christen leichem Glauben gefestigt und gepessert werden. Amen. Wie aber ich zu diesen Dingen leider unwürdig und nicht geweicht bin, noch geordnet Gottes Wort zu predigen und auch an Kunst ein Kind bin, doch trost ich mich deiner Barmherzigkeit, dir als König David spricht, über alle deine Werk ist dein Barmherzigkeit, und geruche mich weisen und lehren mit deines Heiligen Geistes Güte, der mir gnädiglich bei sei. Wann ich mich auch troste deiner göttlichen Wort, die du gesprochen hast, dass der Vater von Himmelreich seinen guten Geist gäb, den die in Pitten, davon bitt ich dich, Herr, mit Andacht. Verleihe mir die Gnad von deins heiligen Gestes Gurte, als St. Pauls Part, dass ich von deinen göttlichen Werken anderen Leuten also schreib, dass ich selbst nicht schuldiger vor deinem Gerichte funden werd.
On the one hand, addressing an audience of uneducated laymen is remarkable. In doing so, the author explicitly places his recipients outside the Latin-speaking clerical sphere, which involves two decisions that, based on everything we've heard about medieval culture so far, apparently no longer need to be mentioned separately: the choice of prose form and the choice of the vernacular. However, being situated outside of the Latin written culture also affects the narrator himself. He's clearly not a priest, but the formulation that he is
An Kunst ein Kind
is less clear. Literally, this only means that he's inexperienced in the technique of conveying God's word. Nevertheless, he seems to have enjoyed a theological education, as can already be seen from the routine handling of the quotation from the Psalms, and in the words of Paul. If you look at the actual gospel work, it quickly becomes apparent that this offers much more than a translation, but contains extensive explanatory and commentary passages that a layman could never have written. Finally, the fact that a large number of other eschatological and heresiological treatises can be attributed to the anonymous individual in question speaks in favour of the assumption that we're dealing with an extremely accomplished theologian. As mentioned, the scholarly work of the Austrian Bible translator is still in its infancy. Nevertheless, I would like to discuss just one example to briefly illustrate the far-reaching consequences that this reappraisal could have for the history of the language. One of the truths of German lexical history that has not remained unchallenged for a long time is that Middle High German Arbeit has predominantly negative connotations like effort, suffering, or agony, which is usually associated with the Christian idea of the Vale of Tears, and or with the contempt for physical work in feudal society. The improvement in the meaning of Arbeit in the sense of gainful work is dated to early New High German, and, with recourse to Max Weber's thesis on the birth of capitalism from Protestant ethics, is associated with the emergence of the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. But in the first half of the 14th century, i.e. 2 centuries before Luther and Calvin, the Austrian Bible translator described his activity as Arbeit, and there is nothing to suggest that he is associated with negative connotations. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have requested the support of Christ for its accomplishment. Language context. The archives of the Lords of Boulay. The small town of Boulay in Lorraine was originally owned by the Lords of Venetrange, and since the 12th century was the seat of a lordship that was successively expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries to include a number of presumably German-speaking towns. Nevertheless, there are feudal connections to the Francophone counts of Luxembourg from the beginning of the 12th century. Because of this, the archives for the Lords of Boulay are very well situated for investigating historical language contact on a small scale. The broad lines initially seem to map the area they controlled, even though Boulay is a few kilometres east of the linguistic border. The chart tradition was dominated by Old French until the end of the 14th century. The choice of language can be analysed in accordance with time, space, and the type of communication partner, i.e. whether issuer or recipient. The result of a longitudinal study shows that here, like everywhere, Latin is being replaced by the vernacular, with German only appearing a generation after the relative consolidation of French. The choice between Latin and vernacular persists throughout the entire period, and regardless of whether the Lords of Boulay were the issuer or recipient of charters, and depends on whether the intended communication partner works in an ecclesiastical institution, such as the Trier or Metz Curia. In such a case, the charter is usually in Latin, otherwise is in French. As far as the relation between the vernacular languages is concerned, the late appearance of German documents in the correspondence of the Lords of Boulay, issuer 1333, recipient 1329, is astonishing because the town, as we have seen, is clearly east of the language border. It is noteworthy, on the one hand, that recipient documents are still written in French, even if their issuers, such as the Lords of Fénétrange and the Counts de la Petite Pierre, had long since switched to German for producing charters. Boulay was clearly francophone on the Schreibsprache level. Given this relatively complex starting point, it is not surprising that Boulay's archive accounts for two-way language contact. Germanic interferences in French documents tend to differ, compared to the converse, in that they usually do not affect the orthography, but rather the lexicon. They are also characterized by explanatory comments.
Nous, Henri, Sieur de Fénétrange, et nous, Gérard de Warnesberg, le Vieil, et nous, Garcil de Freisdorf, Chevalier, et je, Jean, quand dit nimmene front, escuyer. Le près que c'est et est assis à est qu'on appelle der Brüel. Nicolas, le vieux justicier d'Erland, Dietrich de Sept-Fontaines, Thieles, le Scholtes de Boulay, Keinkel de Care. And finally, Thieles jadis prévôt de Boulay.
While the Germanic inclusion in the first example might be explained by the general tendency not to adapt proper names to the target language, the two following cases are technical terms. The specific term Brüel makes it easier to identify the area in question.
Scholtes
designates a specific function within the feudal system, a kind of mayor, although the same person could also be found in French in other sources.
Thieles jadis prévôt de Boulay.
The spelling Zoltes is a characteristic example of orthographic border traffic, as a German term with East French initial spelling. The X denotes a shibboleth. This occurs here in a French language document. The German charters from Boulay show us a number of interferences which, unlike the French sources, are largely limited to correspondences in the graphemic and phonemic systems. 4 cases in particular catch the eye. The use of X for the shibboleth,
just mentioned,
GU for a voiced velar stop before E and I, fronted vowels, OU for U, and hypercorrected H in initial position. The last 3 phenomena mentioned are general Franco-German contact phenomena that cannot be localized more precisely, while the use of X for a shibboleth is attested mainly for Eastern French, especially in Lorraine Schreibsprachen from the first half of the 14th century, mostly in the spelling of place names of Germanic origin. We are dealing here with a relatively small-scale contact phenomena. 1 or more of the interferences mentioned occur in 15 out of 31 corpus texts. However, the quality of the occurrence appears to be more interesting than the quantity. In the vast majority of instances, the Romance interferences only show up in certain situations, for example with select proper names or the hypercorrected H. The systematic occurrence of Roman orthographic interferences is particularly noteworthy in the oldest recipient document, BNFCL 594, number 31. The interferences are marked in colour. We don't have to go into detail to see their importance.
Den Schaden, den ich gelitten han, bi irme bis Hude an diesen Dach, den hat mir wolle bezahlet. Hovet Goat in de Kost, in de allen den Schaden, den ich da ruf heißen, meinte in de Geloben, ich Jehan vorgenannt, vor mich und vor meine Gerben, mit mina Truven in de mit minem Eide, dass wir noch jemand in unseren, in morgen, nummer me den vorgenannten konnen noch sine Gerben, noch jemand anderen, in hieren weh zu Zallen setzen, also von den Stucken hier vorgeschrieben, und verziehen in de Hahn verziehen darob luterlich, vor mich und vor mir nachkommen, zu Hummerme und diese vorgeschriebene gänzliche in de retteliche zu halten.
We have now concluded the first half of the lecture series, which has been oriented towards a culture and textual tradition. In the remaining 4 sessions, we will complement this perspective with a closer look on grammar, trying to deepen and systematize some of the aspects that we have touched on.